Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network, and we are very pleased to have you joining us today for this conversation on ethical investing and the Church's responsibility with the Executive Council's Committee on Corporate and Social Responsibility. I may have mangled that name, but they will correct it for me. But I'm very excited to have them here with us today. And I am thrilled to be welcoming Joanne Hansen from Church Investment Group, who will be moderating this panel with us. A quick reminder that we will be gathering for similar discussions like this at our annual conference in Houston, March 6th through 9th, down in Houston, Texas. We would love to have you join us for discussions around this, particularly in the endowment section, which should be really, really interesting. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Joanne and to this wonderful group of panelists. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you to the panelists.
Whoops. Hi, I'm Joanne Hansen. I'm the president of the Church Investment Group. We are a nonprofit that works with Episcopal Church endowments to help them implement faith-based investing. And it's my pleasure to bring together members of the committee, the Executive Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility, which gets shortened down to CCSR, to talk about the work which they are currently doing in engagement for the church and the long-term advocacy that the Episcopal Church has engaged in over many decades. And so we have together Winnie Varghese, who is the rector at St. Luke's in Atlanta, who organized this initially, and Diana Wilcox, who you will see provided wonderful slides to focus our conversation as we talk today. And she is the rector of Christ Church in Bloomfield and Glen Ridge, New Jersey. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves as they start talking in the interest of time. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We want to leave time at the end to try and address them all. Winnie is going to open us with a prayer before Bill McEwen will talk to us about the history of CCSR.
Thank you, Joanne. Hello, everyone. My name is Winnie, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the Episcopal Church's Executive Council's Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility through the years, for their courageous leadership and moral voice through difficult times. We give you thanks for the witness of our church, Presiding Bishop John Hines, and the great moments of witness that our church can be proud of during the anti-apartheid movement. Jesus calls us to be the hands and feet of God everywhere that we are, and so we ask that you help us to understand the Spirit at work with our money, all of our money, with the great abundance that you have gifted this church. May we be faithful servants of you. Amen.
Amen.
I'm speaking next, I understand. I'm Bill McEwen. I practice a lawyer, but I've been associated with CCSR's activities for 35 years. And I've also been a member of the Task Force on Theology of Money, created by General Convention in 2018. I'm going to give you a quick tour to the history of CCSR. I'm going to ask if Diana would send us through the first couple of slides. There's our committee, and you can see our pictures. And to the fourth slide. This is the timeline, first half of the timeline. I'm going to ask Diana to switch us back and forth between the fourth slide and the fifth slide so we can take a look at the various entries on this. These are official actions of the church through time in relation to its investment activity. The first one is the one to pay the greatest attention to. 1970, the presiding bishop appoints a group to consider DFMS investments to support mission. A long time ago. Diana, would you switch to slide 5, please? And there you go, slide Slide, the last one. Church encourages church institutions to adopt ethically responsible investment policy. 50 plus years. We've ended up in a quite different place from where we started. Going back to slide 4, we didn't know what to do. So that was what the first thing to do was try to figure out what to do. The steps that you see there give you the particular official actions taken by governing bodies of the church, principally General Convention and Executive Council. The first shareholder resolution in history by a corporate investor was filed by the Episcopal Church, the FMS, in 1971 on action of the Executive Council. That action was the direct outcome of the efforts begun in 670 to define how we are to handle it. I should pause and point out that we are talking about official church action about officially owned church assets. Throughout, CCSR is the Committee of Executive Council. Under the authority of Executive Council and General Convention are the assets owned by DFMS, the Domestic and Foreign Mission Society, not the assets owned by any other church entity. So throughout, when we're talking about actions taken by the church nationally for guiding its investments in an ethical way, we're talking solely about dealing directly with the assets of the Domestic and Foreign Mission Society, or DFMS, which represent only a small fraction of all the property, all the investment assets held in the church. The church, over the years, General Convention and Executive Council have adopted, more or less by accident, but by practice, a policy of taking 2 steps when one of those bodies decides on a policy for investment in ethical terms. Typically, the convention or the council has determined that a certain policy is to be adopted by DFMS to govern DFMS's assets. And that's what you'll see as we go through this. In addition, typically, General Convention or Executive Council has adopted a recommendation to the rest of the church, the holding assets to invest, that the other investment entities follow a similar policy. But the policy is not adopted for all the churches in the denomination. It's not adopted for all the dioceses. So going back to the timeline, you see second event after the initial one, something called ICCR Forum. That's the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. That's the ecumenical interfaith organization founded 50 years ago with heavy input from the Episcopal Church to have a common shared group approach across faith-based investors to dealing with ethical issues as investors. And that has become the principal locus of church and church-related faith-based investing, advocacy, and coordination. Now, to continue with a quick tour through these investment asset policies, you see in 85, the church decided to divest from South Africa. In 90, it decided to divest from tobacco. In 97, it decided to end this divestment in South Africa and reinvest. And then in 2001, it considered investment in petroleum, and then military. All these things were done specifically for the national church, for DFMS. Of course, we reversed ourselves in 97 because history unfolded and South Africa changed. We had Nelson Mandela elected as president. It became a more useful, the investment became valuable. Now, move to slide 5, please. Diana, can you move to slide 5? Next slide.
Hold on, I'm trying.
Okay. As long as you can hear me, that's all.
Let me just stop sharing and share it again.
Okay.
Guess for some reason it stopped progressing. There we go.
There we are. Good.
Sorry about that, Bill.
That's fine. We're all learning here. Then, again, divestment in 2014, for-profit prisons. Toward the end of this history, beginning in 2015, 18, and down to the present, you begin to see some changes in the way the church is expressing its policy. In 2015, General Convention voted to divest from fossil fuels, but also to reinvest in clean energy. In 2018, General Convention voted for the first time ever as convention to direct the FMS to take an affirmative investment position, to invest in gun companies, to advocate for changes in the way they did their business. This was the first and so far only investment of what we call impact investing by the DFMS, by the church, in the 50-year history of the church, out of the ordinary portfolio. Then in 2018, the convention also directed us and specifically instructed CCSR to play a role here in developing a human rights screen for the church to use. And in 2019, in a joint effort between CCSR and the committee to which it relates, Executive Council, that policy was developed and was put in place. So you see that toward the end of this time period, CCSR is becoming slightly different in its approach. It's no longer just acting on behalf of the church, it's also being called upon to participate in developing policies in a public way. Then in 2022, we've been asked to apply that policy to China. Finally, I'll point to the last action, which I pointed to at the outset. This is quite different. This is adopting a recommendation to the entire church to adopt this approach, the approach that we are talking about today in this program, as policy for any institutional investor in the church. The General Convention has gone on record saying we all should be doing this. Now, it has not, in fact, adopted that as the policy of DFMS. There's no formal adoption of the policy, but it has adopted the recommendation for everyone, which includes DFMS. So that's the overall picture. There are many, many more actors here, inside and outside the church. This is just what CCSR and General Convention and Executive Council have done over 50 years, but it gives you a basis for the policies that undergird our current actions. I'll stop and let anybody ask me a question.
Well, actually, I'm going to ask you all to save the questions to the end, although I will note Diana is going to speak next about more in depth about CCSR. And this is a fabulous piece which you can access and learn more about the history. One of the questions that was posed already was just to discuss the process of how to decide how various companies are either are excluded or companies with which CCSR chooses to engage. So that question's been posed, but I would ask us to hold our questions to the end so that we can get the full scope of the work that CCSR is doing. And with that, I'll turn it over to Diana.
Okay, that's a good lead in to what I've been doing. And as Joanne had mentioned, I'm a member of CCSR as well, and rector of Christ Church in Bloomfield and Glen Ridge in the Diocese of Newark. So as you've seen over the years, the church has sought to assure that its assets are invested to support and advance environmental sustainability, justice, and human rights at home and abroad, consistent with the church's teachings as expressed at General Convention and Executive Council resolutions. And while the areas that you see on your screen now are areas of focus that may be familiar to you, they're commonly referred to as ESG investing, and they do provide a framework for much of our work. They are consistent with our call to be good stewards of all God's creation and loving one another as Christ loved us. It's just an easier way for us to group some of these things. Environmental just means that investors like us are looking at a company's carbon footprint, its use of renewable energy, its pollution record, its record of using environmentally sensitive suppliers, its public position on climate change and similar factors. Social means that investors like us are looking for companies that pay fair wages and insist that their suppliers pay fair wages. Investors are also looking at hiring practices and the company's record of including women and minorities and other disadvantaged groups. And governance means we're looking at executive compensation. Is it balanced with that of employees? Is there diversity in the boardroom? Does the company actively protect the interests of customers, workers, and shareholders? Now, you look at this screen and it looks all nice and neat and clear-cut circles, but many of these can overlap and can sometimes be in conflict with one another. For example, while we are striving to promote clean energy and a transition to net zero carbon emission, that transition includes mining for lithium used in the production of electric vehicle batteries. The US has only one active lithium mine at Silver Peak in Nevada, but an analysis by the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at Arizona State University found that 9 proposed lithium mines are either on or within 10 miles of indigenous tribal lands. Here's just one example where the need to care for all of God's creation and for all of God's children might be in conflict. And we cannot move toward climate change by violating the dignity and rights of any child of God. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a way forward. It's just that these things are not black and white all the time. That's why we have to dig deeper. But before we take a look at how CCSR and the church does that work, I want to just briefly set aside a common myth about ethical and faith-based investing. You might have heard this too. Opponents of ethical investing claim it compromises financial returns, but this is more myth than fact. Ethical investing reduces risk to companies that may be engaging in business practices where future earnings may be in jeopardy based on increased consumer and shareholder attention to ESG factors. And studies have also shown that in the long run, it's also good for shareholder earnings. However, as we'll discuss later in the slideshow and in this presentation, this is now under threat, the ability for us to do ESG-based investing. So how do we do this work? We don't do it alone. We have partners without whom this work would be absolutely impossible to achieve. We engage with consultants at Mercy Investment Services and the Heartland Initiative to aid in completing the work of the church across the corporate advocacy year, which normally stretches from the fall to the late spring. Mercy provides shareholder advocacy and consulting, while Heartland provides the guidance for implementing that human rights investment screen that Bill was talking about earlier, and the church's no-buy policy on military contracting. It would be absolutely impossible for us as a group of volunteers to navigate the ever-changing landscape of high-risk areas and global conflicts. So Heartland provides in-depth and up-to-date analysis to guide us. Actively engaging in filing shareholder resolutions is also time-consuming when at the scale of something as large as the investments of our church. So Mercy Investment Services provides needed consulting and shareholder advocacy. In several additional areas, committee members, we do work independently of our consultants, particularly in the area of healthcare access for reproductive and gender-affirming care. We also work alongside the staff at the Episcopal Church Office of Government Relations, OGR, as many of the issues on corporate policy overlap with OGR's work in public policy. This is also how we can sometimes discover that a company may be promising change while we're in our negotiations with them, but actively lobbying against those very objectives on the federal level. And we work with the church pension group in the areas of climate change, human trafficking, board diversity, and support on proxy voting guidelines. We also have faith-based partnerships, which allow us to leverage our collective strength for greater impact. And these are just a few of them. In addition to the Church Pension Group, we also partner with the investment managers for the Church of England on issues of mutual concern. There are also some dioceses and parishes that align their investments with the larger church investment strategies, including our approach to ethical, sustainable investment. And we sure hope that this presentation today will encourage more parishes and dioceses to engage in this work. And while we're also investigating the issues of mining and indigenous land rights, as noted earlier, we're working with coalitions of faith-based investors on that very subject, like Interfaith Center on Interfaith Center on corporate responsibility. That last one is one to really focus on. We're a founding member of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, ICCR, a coalition of faith and values-based investors. ICCR has a more than 50-year track record of successfully engaging corporations on human rights, the environment, racial justice, health equity, corporate governance, and financial services. At the recent fall conference, CCSR members joined with others to explore and collaborate on topics including advancing worker justice and advocating for a living wage, artificial intelligence and its impact on society and democracy, and racial justice investing and its impact on fostering a stronger democracy. These conferences are held twice each year, in the fall and in the spring, in New York City, and are open to all. The ICCR website also has invaluable resources for ethical investing. For example, there are presentations on the effectiveness of that type of investing that might be helpful in discussions with your parish or diocese, and others that cover how to file a shareholder resolution. A link is going to be provided later in this presentation to the ICCR resource page, and specific resources will be given to those who registered for this workshop. So now you can see the history of our work, why we do this work, that we don't do it on our own, but with a network of strong partnerships and consultants. And now, how do we do it? Each triennium, a CCSR addresses assignments received from General Convention or Executive Council, reviews the DFMS portfolio to identify recommended actions in support of those policies. As noted before, experienced investment consultants engaged by DFMS advise us in our work. And I should note that these policies don't come out of nowhere. They come from you. They come from the people who attend General Convention, which bubbles up from the diocese, which bubbles up again from parishes. They come from each and every one of you. And so you have a say in the policies that the church pursues. We get together at in-person and virtual meetings of the full CCSR team of members, consultants, and partners, and we review the status of our engagements, any new assignments, and information from our screeners and consultants. Then we propose for the consideration of council, shareholder engagement, and action plans for DFMS or other church institutional investors, and we help DFMS and on occasion other investors to execute those recommendations. Our full report in the General Convention Blue Book, which is available online, lists and details the companies we are currently engaging, the objective of every engagement, and the status. And later, Brian is going to go over some specific areas of our current focus. So now on to the detail of how we move from our initial desire for change to a final result. As followers of Jesus, we seek to first have a conversation about issues of concern, beginning our work in dialogue with corporations whose shares we own, often in partnership with other investors, primarily those that are faith-based. Depending on how that dialogue proceeds, we may also file shareholder resolutions, leveraging the strength of our investment to add additional incentive for the companies to respond to our concerns. And by the way, I should note that when Bill mentioned earlier that we invested in a gun company, we did that because you can't engage in shareholder resolutions unless you actually are holding shares. And so in order to get to that step, that's a way that a direction we went in order to be able to get to this next step in the conversation. In some cases, we're the lead investors on the filings, the ones driving the effort, and other times we follow the lead of our partners. You know, if you've not been involved in this, you might wonder why resolutions are being used. When dialogue has proven unsuccessful or a company is unresponsive, filing escalates the engagement beyond those initial conversations with investor relations boards directly to the board of directors, with the potential to go in front of all shareholders for a vote at the company's annual meeting. Resolutions are also included in a company's annual proxy statement provided to all shareholders ahead of the annual meeting, which is an effective way to inform other investors about an issue. And finally, resolutions signal that investors are willing to air their grievances publicly and in the press, which often brings management to the table. So sometimes the very act of filing the resolution leads to further dialogue and a response from the company sufficient for us to withdraw the filing. Other times, our resolutions proceed to a vote at the company's annual general meeting. And since most votes at corporate meetings are overwhelmingly in favor, even a significant minority vote can put pressure on the company to make changes, or at least to engage in further dialogue with us. Most of all, though, we know that this work requires a long-term view in which change happens over many years, even decades. And so we remain steadfast in our commitment to our mission until it is complete. Just look at how long it took for that initial action for General Motors to divest from South Africa, 15 years. We didn't give up because it was just too important. So now Brian will take you through some specific areas we're working on right now, as well as reviewing our current no-buy list.
And Brian, one of the questions that people have asked is, where do I find the no-buy list? And I know that you can find it on the Church Center's website. It's a little bit of a navigation, but hopefully you can point people to the right spot.
Yes, thank you, Joanne. That is on a finance page of the website of the episcopalchurch.org to see the list of companies that are there. Thank you. I'm Brian Greaves, and I served as the church's Peace and Justice Officer and as primary staff during that time to the CCSR committee. So, and that was from 1988 through 2009. And then I served again as chair or vice chair of this committee from 2016 until the present day. So I've got a significant history with the committee. It's a committee I've always enjoyed because we actually get some things done. People have asked often whether or not we as a committee or if the church itself has participated in the controversial areas of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, known as BDS. And the answer to that is yes and no. We do not generally participate in any BDS campaign organized by other entities, but we certainly have a history as a church of supporting BDS issues over the last 50 plus years. I think of the 1979 Nestle boycott, for example, for its infant formula products that threatened the health of infants in developing countries. We took that action in 1979. We called for sanctions against Sudan and, of course, South Africa. And we have divested from companies supporting apartheid and also in Sudan. So there are other examples I could point to, but our history on BDS has been on a case-by-case basis. Now, I'm calling your attention to the slide that's before you to talk about the no-buy list that we currently are maintaining at the direction of the church. And I'll take these in chronological order. First of all, on tobacco, Bill mentioned this earlier. This was done in 1990 when the Executive Council voted to divest of shares in companies that manufacture tobacco products. And I think I can safely say that that is one of our less controversial exclusions. And the no-buy list are sometimes referred to as exclusion lists, sometimes referred to as divestment lists. The second one I would mention is militarism, as you can see there on the screen. This was developed as a policy for the first time in 2003, when the Executive Council voted to exclude or divest from any company among the top 5 U.S. defense contractors. And that is measured in dollar volume of sales. And secondly, from any company among the top 50 defense contractors that receives more than 50% of its revenues from military contracts. Now, in 2015, there were 2 other actions taken at General Convention that created 2 more no-buy lists. One was on for-profit prisons. You see the lower right-hand corner there. General Convention called for excluding or divesting of companies that operate for-profit prisons. Those are private prisons, and there are 4 such companies listed on that list. On fossil fuels, that was also an action of the 2015 General Convention. It made us a leader at the time to call for divestment from all of fossil fuel companies in our portfolio. And I think that was a very significant action taken at that time, and has been part of a movement that has grown over the years. I would point, for example, to the Church of England's Pensions Board, which announced its decision to divest of fossil fuels in June of 2023. It was a significant time. And then the 5th area is the human rights screen that was called for by the 2018 General Convention and adopted by the Executive Council in 2019 after the CCSR committee submitted a policy proposal. And this is to exclude or divest from companies that support or benefit from the denial of human rights against any people anywhere. This is a global screen that includes places like the occupied Palestinian territories, Myanmar, Sudan, China with the Uyghurs, and elsewhere. That we look at these areas very carefully. So those are the 5 areas that we have created these screens for at the direction of a General Convention or Executive Council. On the next slide, if I could have the next one up, Diana, you have to do this again, okay. There it is, okay. Just a couple of things to add to what I said about those 5 that are currently being looked at by our committee. In 2023, we actually updated the policy on militarism. And that was a lot of work. And we wanted to clarify the church's position on this to make sure that all the various issues around nuclear weapons, around weapons of mass destruction, were being embraced in this policy. And there are some controversial weapon systems, such as cluster bombs, that the church has not yet actually named at General Convention or at Executive Council. So we hope to introduce a resolution this summer at General Convention on a number of other types of controversial weapons, such as cluster bombs. Then on fossil fuels, we have a resolution that we will introduce at this convention to remove some lagged stocks that are still in the portfolio that are still fossil fuel companies. So we think that after 9 years, it's time to complete that process. And then on human rights, we have had several companies in 2023 related to the occupied Palestinian territories and to Ukraine, and even to one very odious company in Mexico. So you see those there. So the committee is actively engaged in this. Now, having given you this thumbnail sketch on these 5 no-buy lists, I want to go on to the next slide, slide 16. And I do want to emphasize that the primary work of CCSR is through engagement with corporations. That's where we do the vast majority of our work. We still have a lot of companies that could go on the human rights no-buy list, but we are still working through engaging with corporations because our goal is to change behaviors we believe will benefit society and our world. And this slide shows a glimpse of the many issues that CCSR and our ecumenical partners at ICCR engage in with the corporate world. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Joanne.
So before I talk to you all about ways in which your parishes and dioceses can engage in faith-based investing, unfortunately, I need to talk to you about the efforts that are ongoing now to block sustainable investing. And you can see from this slide that there have been over 160 legislative proposals which have been introduced in many states, which would restrict primarily public, but there's a chilling effect for private investors from using environmental, social, governance factors in considering their investments. And I think one of the more, and this is my personal opinion, egregious examples of that is New Hampshire has proposed to make it a felony to consider ESG for public investments. That has a minimum of 1 year in prison to a maximum of 20 years. Now, how do we get to this state where there's this active pushback against sustainable investing? And when you look under the hood, and Diana referenced lobbying, and part of a very serious part of ICCR's work is looking at lobbying. Where is the money coming from and what's its intent? And a major player in the anti-ESG effort is the State Financial Officers Foundation. And that is largely Republican entities. And if you go to Influence Map, which is a nonprofit that works in conjunction with ICCR to take a look at where's the money, you will find that a significant funding for that financial officers organization is coming from the American Petroleum Institute and from active anti-climate activists. And so they are funding an enormous amount of this effort. And so essentially, as sustainable investing has grown, as the urgency of doing an energy transition has increased, the fossil fuel industry is funneling enormous amounts of money into pushback. And our advocacy is faith-based entities, is nonprofits like ICCR. So I wouldn't say it's David and Goliath, but I would say that they have a lot of money that they're bringing to bear on this issue. Church Investment Group is a signatory to an effort called Freedom to Invest to counter these efforts. And you can engage with your local, with your state, with your national political representatives to talk to them about why all investors should have the right to consider relevant risks and opportunities when they make their investments. And your efforts would be particularly helpful if you happen to reside in states like North Carolina, Texas, New Hampshire, where these kinds of legislative efforts are underway. So Diana, if you could switch to the next slide, I want to go to the more optimistic, more energizing side of how do you engage in faith-based investing? You can see that here it references CCSR's proxy voting efforts, and And we've touched on already how you can reach out yourselves to your state and federal legislators. And if we could shift to the next slide. This is a series of resources that you will get. This is being taped, and you will get the resources sent out to you after the webinar is over. The first resource here, Bill referenced it, is the Theology of Money report, which talks about 15 Episcopal parishes, dioceses, and entities which have already implemented faith-based investing. And so they serve as templates, as examples, and you can take a look at that. That was produced in conjunction with the last General Convention. Intentional Endowment Network, I think, is a great resource, also a nonprofit, and they have a roadmap which takes you through all of the various steps from the very first, let's learn about ethical investing, through to implementing and then tracking. Now that we've done this, are we having any impact on the real world? So that's a link through to their roadmap. Selecting a new investment advisor. Values Advisor is another nonprofit, and you can subscribe to them with the password CIG, and they have a pre-screened selection of investment advisors who are looking to do ethical and impact-oriented investing. So you can go in, you can look for your size. They go as small as investors who have 250,000 all the way up to 100 million. You can look at geography, you can look at investment approaches, and that's a resource for a range of different investment advisors who can help you in this journey. Invest Your Values is if you already have mutual funds and existing investments, you can go in, put in the name of those mutual funds, and take a look at what's going under the hood. What themes, what companies. Alas, in some instances, you will see mutual funds that are claiming they're green and then they've got X on. So you have to take a look and see, are they actually walking the walk? And Diana already touched on the fact that people legitimately want to understand whether or not they may be sacrificing returns. And so this is a resource on Church Investment Group's website that goes to various academic studies. So you can take a look at the academic research on the fact that ethical investing delivers equivalent returns. Could we move? And so that was a lightning round of various approaches to how to walk that journey. And here's another lightning round of proxy voting resources. Diana has already pointed you to ICCR, fabulous research there, and discussions of how to file a stockholder resolution. Although I will say this is, it has been done by individuals, but it tends to be best in conjunction with organizations like the CCSR, ICCR, and folks who have devoted many years to putting these together. The Blue Book also gives you a sense of the work that the CCSR is undertaking. And then CIG has structured its equity holdings as direct stock holdings so that we can, in fact, vote our proxies directly. If you hold mutual funds, you can go and ask your mutual fund, how are you voting your proxies? That's not an easy question to get answered. And so we hold direct stock so that we can do that voting. And there's Glass Lewis is one of the proxy voting companies, ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services. You can select climate-oriented guidelines if you are using those proxy voting services. And then As You Sow, which I referenced previously, has two types of proxy voting services. For retail investors, it's, as I understand, free. And then for institutional investors, you can, at a very low cost, vote in alignment with As You Sow's guidelines. So this was a very lightning round of trying to give you resources that you can use to implement and engage in ethical investing. And with that, we are coming up towards the end of the time, and we wanted to provide time for folks to ask questions. And I know that one of the, which has been touched on, was the process, and I hope you've gotten a good sense of how this collection of individuals and the church work together to address the issues that they focus on. Diana, I don't know if you want to touch a little bit more on some of the key issues that you see the committee looking at going into 2024.
You mean in the next triennium that we're working on? We did just finish a resolution that went on to executive committee, and perhaps Winnie or Brian or Bill, I can see if I can pull that up, around cluster bombs and military contracting. And then, of course, as we mentioned before, we have a whole 58-page report on all the different things that we're working on. Bill, Brian, Winnie, do you all want to bring out any particular thing that we're working on in the next couple of?
I don't think so. I did want to respond to one early question that appeared in the chat, which was, how does the church decide the policies? That's basically what the question was. And I think it would be wise to point out that when we're talking about actions by General Convention and Executive Council, basically these are, if I may use the word, not a dirty word, political decisions. The church, through its processes of decision-making, decides to divest from something, to adopt a human rights policy. How that happens? Well, if you're part of the church, you're familiar with how that happens. It happens over time and through a great deal of work. Sometimes CCSR is directly involved, sometimes not. So that's, and another question was, are there any templates? The answer is no, because it is a political process. You end up with a result, and then perhaps CCSR is asked to help implement it.
Well, I also want to just jump on that too, and say that I'm very serious when I say it comes from all of you. And by that, I mean all of you across the church. This isn't a top-down approach per se. It's so at diocesan conventions, for instance, there may be resolutions that someone brings forward that says, we believe that we need to, just to take an easy one, not invest in any company that is violating human rights in mining anywhere around the world. And that then goes on to General Convention. That's coming up from people within parishes up to through diocese and then into General Convention, where it would be voted on, or it may come from people who are elected to Executive Council who are then bringing it forward. In other words, very much like our prayer book, things don't get dropped down, things come out from the people. It's based on this group of followers of Jesus Christ who feel called to make change in the world, because we're called to be good stewards of both creation and one another. And so people out of their faith come forward and ask the church, what more can we do? And because the church does have some ability based on the when you have investments, you have say, you have sway in a company. We can make change. And so I think it's really important that you all know that you have a voice in how we approach this work.
So a question was asked about fossil fuel divestment, and it's very important to have the link that it's not just divestment, but it is also looking to invest proactively in areas like renewable energy and various other things that will help with the energy transition. And it was referenced previously that the church commissioners has decided to divest, and that decision was made quite recently. However, they had a very long, I think it's north of 8 years, engagement with the fossil fuel industry, Exxon, the large companies, to see if they, in fact, could see signs of progress, signs that they were actually taking it seriously to have an energy transition. And their conclusion was no. And so they have moved on and are looking at other heavier emitting industries like chemicals and steel, and trying to engage with those companies to see if they can make progress. But essentially, the conclusion over a very long period of engagement on the behalf of the church commissioners was engagement is not changing behavior. So that's my assessment of that particular issue. It is the divestment is a result of the feeling that the engagement is just not changing. And with that, I'll open it up to the other members of the committee to take on that topic.
Thank you, Joanne. I just to add to that, there was a question about whether if a company changes its policies, if it's removed from the list, maybe an example of that, particularly in working with ICCR. And they're just a wonderful group to follow if you're thinking about how you can do this where you are. So I've had a colleague that I've known for a long time. Part of his job was to go to the places where products, to factories around the world, and to tell people in this country what the supply chain looked like. So he would go to corporate meetings to say, this is what's happening in your factory in Bangladesh or something like that. And a part of his work was not just to, shut down these companies. It was to make them better neighbors, right? To make them good corporate actors. That's the agenda. And so, the way that story kind of twists around is he ended up kind of knowing everybody in all those offices, the person that you talked to about supply chain. And that's what ICCR does. They're in conversation about how corporations both understand their supply chain, but also are held accountable to it. And the idea is to make better companies, which we believe are actually better for all of us. So there are absolutely ways for these lists change because groups like ICCR are watching them. So we can also decide that we want to specifically focus on a company or an industry, but in general, most of our work is in partnership with these organizations that are doing this work all the time.
The history of the church in this field of investment has focused largely on, as the timeline shows, negative reaction to bad actors. Okay, and that leads it to look like being an ethical investor means being an investor who divests from investment, but that's not what an ethical investor is. An ethical investor is one who adopts a comprehensive approach, decides to invest in an affirmative way and to achieve positive results, and then as a secondary and has dialogue with the companies to get them to change their positions, and then as a final resort may divest. So as Brian was sketching in dealing with our newly developed universal human rights policy, the first step is engagement. It's exactly what the Church of England did to deal with fossil fuel companies. Years of engagement to try to get the company to change before you divest. But of course, way back in the beginning, when we start out with South Africa, there was no history, there's no capacity to have this kind of engagement. Now we do.
And it's good for companies too. As I mentioned, this reduces company risk. If they're engaged in something that eventually is going to bubble up and create a problem for them, the earlier that they can start to find out that one of their suppliers, for instance, is committing human rights atrocities, and that this is going to end up causing a great deal of problems for them, not just publicity wise, but when they have to shut down that supply chain, do they have, is it a sole source provider? So, this is good for companies. It's not just, it's not just a stick. It's also a way to work with them, to partner with them. They end up in a better place, as do we and the rest of the world.
It is, particularly when you're dealing with the energy transition, an incredibly complex topic. And one of the questioners raised the issue of, if you have fossil fuel companies that are also engaging in the renewable area, how do you balance that? And it is a company by company issue. Although I would note that many of the companies, you're seeing a lot of advertising about all their green activities, but I would ask you to take a look at what share of their capital expenditures is that? Is it really significant? Is it something that's moving the needle? But I think it is really important to emphasize that the energy transition is unbelievably complicated, lots of different moving parts. And so in CIG's case, we have really two different pathways. We have parishes that have decided to divest, and we also have parishes that have felt that they should continue to invest and engage. And I think that is, it's a dialogue within your own parish or diocese about which end of the needle you feel you're on. As I pointed out, I think the church commissioners felt that they had gone through that process and were not having a real world impact. And that's why they ultimately, this past year, decided to divest.
Everybody has the climate change. Every company has a climate change problem. All of us in our lives have to deal with changing our energy footprint. So if you leave fossil fuel companies behind, if you divest from them, there's still thousands of other companies which have a role in the impact of climate change on our world that you can make positive impact with if you invest with them. And whether they're in the business of building some kind of equipment that's useful for that, or whether they're just consumers of power themselves in their regular work. So it's not an either or, divest or don't divest. There's plenty of opportunity to do more than just sit on the sideline.
Someone asked about the Conference of Parties, and I have to confess that's not an organization that I'm familiar with. If anyone else, so I apologize, we're not able to address that. I mean, we are coming on. Someone is saying relating to COP.
Yes.
We are coming down on our time. We have hoped that we are looking in the chat and talking simultaneously, that we've addressed your questions. The presentation has been taped, will be sent out with the slides and the various resources. We have our emails in there. And so if you have questions that we did not get to, or you'd like to delve into in greater depth, please reach out and we will attempt to assist you and answer your question. And with that, I would like to thank all of the members of the CCSR. They do incredible work, devote a lot of time to all these complex issues. And we really, I can speak as an Episcopalian, deeply appreciate their efforts. I don't know, Winnie, if you want to close us with a final prayer. So with that, I think we are about at time, and I thank the panelists and I thank you for participating. And I hope you've gotten a better sense of how the Episcopal Church is engaging in the world and doing advocacy to make it a better world. Thank you so much.